Alright, it's time for another update and forecast on the Boise fire. We did have some growth on it yesterday, so it's up over 9,000 acres, still 0% containment. So based on that we've had some growth recently, still 0% containment, that sounds like bad news, but that's kind of more evidence for why we say that these numbers don't actually mean all that much, because as we'll talk about in this video, there's actually some great work done on the Boise fire yesterday that has made us feel a little bit more confident about it not going into the Orleans area. Now, if you don't know the Orleans area, that's why we're going to break down this video into 3 different sections, with the first one being where is the fire, and then we're going to go into the current situation, and then finally the wildfire forecast to try to predict where we're going to see some growth throughout the day today, if any at all. And then you can find the timestamps for these different sections in the comments if, for example, you want to just skip straight to the current situation or something. But first off, we're going to go into where is the fire. And I like this map first because we can take the wide view of Northern California. Then we're going to zoom up here into the northwestern portions of California. And that is where we have the Boise fire. And the reason that we are concerned about this one is there are some structures near the Boise fire. If we turn on structures, anywhere where you see those orange dots, that's where you have some structures, and you notice it's mostly up here towards the northwest of the fire. And we can also see where there has been recent growth by looking at the progression map. So green is going to be some of the early growth on this fire, the first couple of days. Orange is maybe 4 days ago, and then red is going to be your recent growth. And it does look like it's been growing in all sorts of different directions, mostly up towards the north and then also to the east. Keep in mind, some of this is purposeful firing operations where they actually clear out the fuels on purpose so that by the time the fire gets there, there's no more fuels to burn. But clearly the largest amount of growth was on that northern side. So I actually want to go over to Google Earth. And what we can do is, this is the perimeter we were looking at yesterday. And where we were predicting some growth was going to be continued on this northeastern side right here, and then also more to the east right here, because the winds were pushing to the east. And then in this part of the fire, can't really tell from that angle, but from this angle you can see it's very steep terrain right there with a lot of fuel that hasn't burnt out in a very long time. So that's where we were predicting some growth. And now let's click on today's perimeter. And you can see that looks to be the key places where we did end up seeing some growth on this fire. Up in that steep terrain where we have a lot of fuel, and then also more on this eastern side where the winds were pushing it down this canyon right there. I believe that's called Granite Creek drainage. Not totally positive there. Still learning the area. And then notice we also saw it filling in a bit on the western side right here. But some of that may actually be purposeful firing operations. I listened to the briefing and it sounds like they had favorable conditions last night, so they put in some fire on the ground so that by the time the fire gets there again, no fuels in that area left. So should have probably pointed out Orleans first when we came to this map, but Orleans is over here towards the northwest. That goes along with that cluster of structures we saw on the other map. And you notice when we click on and off the growth, it looks like there was continued growth on this western side. But again, I think that may have actually been a mix between the firing operation and the fire moving itself. Regardless, though, it looks like they are holding it on this ridge right here, which is exactly where they want to hold it. Maybe has started to slop over a little bit. You can see right there where that line at the top, that is your firing operation. So it looks like the firing operation has certainly been holding. But then we're also looking at a dozer line and a hand line. And it's kind of hard to tell because we can't see those on this map. But last I heard, their main objective today was to continue to hold it up here and not let it push closer towards Orleans. So if they're saying continue to hold it, it makes me think that it is still holding right now. Now, a couple other things that I'd notice on this side, because this is where the main concern is, because we have Orleans over here to the west. why I'm not too concerned is right now it does look to be that firing operation's holding. And then, as I'll show in a second, we also have dozer line, hand line with increased firing operation last night. There is a lot of fuel in this area that hasn't burnt out in a very long time. But notice that topography is actually going to start working in our favor. In order for this fire to get to Orleans, it would have to go downhill. And fire moves a lot more slowly downhill than it does uphill. Just for proof of that, we can see what happened 2 days ago on this fire. So I'll turn off the last two perimeters. And we can zoom in here. You can see where it established down at the bottom of this mountain. And then look what happened 2 days ago. It just rushed up that. So the main factor there, even more than the impact weather had on the fire, is the fact that it's steep terrain. So it's able to preheat the fuels before the fire gets there. And then also the large amount of fuels. So there's a couple of things that I've touched on right there that kind of tie into the current situation. So I think we now know where the fire is. It's just east of Orleans, and it's up in the northwestern parts of California. Now I want to get to the current situation, and we're going to tie in those two things that we've already touched upon. The first one being operations, the second one being fire history. So first off, total personnel is now up to 816, so that's an increase of about 200 from what we were looking at yesterday. And then we can also go to CAL FIRE to look at the resources. It says 5 helicopters, 16 engines, 2 dozers, 9 crews. I don't believe those have increased since yesterday, but this website might also have not been updated recently. And part of the evidence that we have for that is it's still saying 8,600 acres, but then watch duty is saying 9,600 acres. So perhaps there have been more resources getting to the fire than what is shown right here. It just hasn't been updated on the website yet. And based on the fact that they've been able to hold it on that western side, I would think we do have more resources than what's being shown right there. But just getting back to what those resources have been doing, and especially on that northwestern side, because again, towards the northwest, that's where we have Orleans and some of our structures. That is the main priority. You can see the firing operation right there. But then on this map, why I like this one is you can see the other operations that they've been doing. So that black X is going to be your dozer line. And, oh, interesting. So earlier we were wondering if that little finger right there on the fire was where it had slopped over the dozer line, but it actually looks like that's holding on the dozer line. And who knows, that might even be a firing operation where a lot of times what they'll do is they'll clear out the fuels with a dozer, but then they'll burn off of it to increase the distance where you don't have fuels. So then it's even harder for the fire to move through that area, because fire can't just burn through dirt. It needs some fuel to continue combustion, because in order for combustion to occur, you have to have heat, oxygen, and fuel. So if you remove one of those sides of the fire triangle, then combustion can't occur. So that could actually be a firing operation. I'm glad we were able to look at this map to confirm that. But regardless, it hasn't jumped over the dozer line there yet. And then where you see the H, that's where we have a hand line. And that one looks to be holding, and I believe they're actually going to try to kind of reinforce that with some firing operations as well. Not sure when this fire perimeter is from, but they may have been able to do that last night because they did have some favorable conditions last night with a lot of moisture moving in over the fire. And then also some smoke settling over the fire as well, which has kind of minimized the activity we've been seeing this morning. Last thing I want to point out here, other than the fact that it hasn't crossed those lines, is that even if it does, it's going to be moving downhill, which fire doesn't like to do. And then they have more lines down here. So primary lines, secondary lines, and then they also have some crews going into Orleans to prepare structures where necessary. So operations looking good on the northwest. I've also heard that they're planning on sending some crews over here on the east side and the southeast side and even the southern side as well to start putting in lines to contain this fire from moving more to the east and to the south. But one thing that does work in our favor when thinking about the east and the south is fire history. So when we turn on fire history, first thing I'm going to point out is where the Boise fire has been burning, there's no fire history. So that's why we have seen some pretty active behavior on this in previous days. There's 2 days ago, we had a huge pyrocumulus cloud coming off of it. And that's fuels that have been accumulating for a very long time in very steep terrain. So you have two sides of the fire behavior triangle working against you. Fire behavior triangles, fuel, weather, and topography. Weather actually hasn't been the biggest factor on this fire. It's been more fuel and topography working together to especially lead to that growth that we saw in the north right there. But hopefully we'll start to get some help from the fire history that we have in this area. Towards the north, we have the 2023 Perch Fire, and I think it's easier to see if we go perimeters only right here. It does look to be holding right there, so that could be a dozer line that they have on the ridge, or it could also be the fact that now that it's gotten to the ridge, now it's going to slow down because instead of being able to rush uphill, it now has to go downhill, and it actually looks like there's less fuel on this other side of the ridge, and I wonder if that's because of the fire history in that area. And if we click on today's perimeter, notice that was the growth we had between yesterday and today's perimeter maps. Very little growth yesterday. So I believe that's a combination of whether they maybe have a line on top of this ridge, or the fact that it's now going downhill, or the fact that it's now going into fire history where, if you look at the different color shadings of the two sides of this mountain, dark green on this side where there's no fire history and the fuel has been accumulating, and not much fire history over here. Or not much fuel over here because of that fire history. Does look like we have some spots down on this side though, so it'll be interesting to see if those grow throughout the day today. But overall, not nearly as much growth on that northern side as what we have had in previous days. And for all the reasons that we just discussed. Now, one burn scar that doesn't actually seem to be helping us all that much is the 2013 Butler scar right here. The reason I say that is because the Boise fire has just been rushing right through that. So it seems that enough of the fuels have been able to regrow in the last 11 years that burn scar is now doesn't seem to be helping us all that much. And then we have the 2020 Red Fire down here to the south. It's interesting. I started doing wildfire forecasts in 2020, but I don't remember this one. But it looks like it was a pretty large fire. But it does look like it cleared out the fuels enough to actually be helping resist some growth in this area. And what can also happen, sometimes they're able to reuse the dozer lines that they might have used in the past on the Red Fire. They're able to kind of redo those and reuse them for this fire. It also looks like that's a firing operation. See the weird shape of the fire perimeter right there? That's a pretty telltale sign that they've purposely cleared out the fuels when there's favorable conditions to kind of diminish any growth as that fire continues to move to the south. We haven't seen too much growth to the south recently, but if we turn on the heat detections, it does look like there's been some red on that southern side right there, and there's still this pocket of unburnt fuel where there hasn't been a fire in a very long time, so wouldn't be surprised to continue to see some growth on that southern side there, but it looks like we will get some help from the Red Fire if it does continue to move south. So based on that, it looks like the northwest side's holding, south has this burn scar, north has that burn scar. Butler doesn't seem to be helping all that much, and we still have that unburnt pocket right there. So kind of at first glance, we'll take a look at the weather forecast in a minute before I do my official wildfire forecast, but I wouldn't be surprised to see that fill in throughout the day today. Some more growth on the south, and then most likely some more growth on the east right here. And probably even, I think the important part is the weather forecast. But before we do the weather forecast, we have to look at current conditions, because that's always where I start. I'm a broadcast meteorologist on the Central Coast, and the first thing I do is check out current conditions. That gives you a foundation for your forecast. So right now, looks like there's a lot of smoke over the fire, and you actually like to see that because it diminishes the daytime heating. The more smoke you have, it's almost like a big cloud, so you don't warm up as much, which means you don't dry out as much, which means you usually don't get as strong of afternoon winds either, especially when you have terrain like what we're seeing. And to actually check out the stations on the ground, here's Orleans right there. Station, it's showing 62 degrees right now. That's nice and cool. Max RH, it says 100%. So that is exactly what you want to see. That there is a lot of moisture that moved in overnight. That's as good of a moisture recovery as you possibly could have. And then minimum temperature overnight, 44. So it really dropped down overnight. We like to see that as well. I would say the best news on this is that 58% minimum relative humidity. So that shows that smoke shading throughout the morning has been helping us not warm up and dry out too much, because at this point, it's 11:30. You would expect it to be drier than a 58% relative humidity, but that looks pretty good right there. That's a little concerning, 14 miles per hour for the wind, but it's not that windy out there. And we're not expecting any kind of critical conditions throughout the day today. But with that being said, I think we've wrapped up the current situation. Let's now get into the wildfire forecast. And the first place that we will start is the weather forecast. So there's today, there's tonight, there's tomorrow. Looks like it's mild temperatures. This is showing low 80s, but in some parts of the fire, we're just seeing some mid 70s out there. Relative humidity not dropping very low. For example, to put this into comparison on the park fire, we were seeing relative humidity drop into the teens and even the single digits. This is saying it's dropping around 30 to 40%. That's not bad. And then there's going to be another great recovery overnight tonight into the mid to high 70s, maybe even that 100% that we saw last night. And then tomorrow looks like slightly warmer conditions tomorrow and slightly drier conditions tomorrow. So going to keep an eye on that. Winds look to still be from the southwest, so that's going to try to push the fire towards the northeast. National Weather Service is saying 8 mile per hour winds. If we look at windy, this is saying some 25 mile per hour winds. Yesterday, I looked at one of the stations. We did have some 25 mile per hour gusts, expecting somewhat similar conditions throughout the day today. And the observation on the ground is already showing 14. So I would say the truth is probably somewhere between what the National Weather Service is saying and the ECMWF, which is the European model. So maybe some 20 mile per hour winds today, but we have a decent amount of moisture over the fire, and that I would say is a more important factor when it comes to this fire. So with all that being said, I don't think the weather forecast is actually the most important part when it comes to where we're going to see growth on the Boise fire today. This fire has mostly been driven by fuel and topography recently, so I think it's going to continue to be mostly driven by fuel and topography, especially in this pocket right here. Expecting some growth right there where there's still a lot of unburnt fuel that has been accumulating for quite some time. Same with that southern edge right there. And then the eastern edge, that's actually where winds are playing some factor, because the wind is coming from the west. It's going to try to continue to push it towards the east. But based on the fact that we have a lot of smoke over the fire right now, and we have a lot of moisture over the fire throughout the day today, not expecting a critical day on the fire, and not expecting any new threats to Orleans, because that northwestern side seems to be holding. So overall, Boise fire, I'd say, looking pretty good throughout the day today, and it looks like there's cool, moist conditions expected moving forward, at least relatively speaking, of what we could have at this point in the season. So keeping an eye on it. But I think that kind of wraps up our wildfire forecast for today. Hopefully this video was helpful, and thanks for watching.